To me, Brian never felt comfortable singing Bon Scott era songs, mainly because they're not his, mainly because he was stepping into someone else's shoes, a dead man's shoes if you want. In the same way that Ronnie James Dio, great singer though he is, could never do Ozzy Osbourne era Black Sabbath justice, in the same way that Sammy Hagar, great singer though he is, could never do justice to David Lee Roth era Van Halen, because those songs were tailored to certain people. And I don't think Brian Johnson has ever felt comfortable doing anything from the Bon Scott era, because it doesn't fit. He wasn't the Bon Scott character. However, he became an effective live performer in the way that he presented what he was. And he was a lovable character. He was a jovial man on the street who came on the stage and just entertained. It was Angus who became the focal point as far as the personality of the band was concerned, and also the stage show. And the lighting was impressive, the sound was crystal clear, and AC/DC just drove everything forward. And let's not forget, they had the best rhythm section in the world with Phil Rudd, Cliff Williams and Malcolm Young. That is unbeatable. Phil Rudd was fired by the band during the recording sessions for the Flick of the Switch album. The reasons basically came down to drink and drugs. Rudd couldn't cut it anymore, and therefore they fired him.
He left to, I believe, become a helicopter pilot, or he went into aviation, bought a plane or something like this.
Apparently he said that what he did do is he retired to fly aeroplanes in Australia. I don't know whether that's an allusion to something else, but apparently he probably did fly a few aeroplanes.
Now there is a story, they brought in a guy called Barry T. Wilson, who used to be in Procol Harum, to do some of the drumming sessions to complete the album, but never used anything he did. All the drumming apparently on Flick of the Switch was Phil Rudd's. They brought in Simon Wright, who was very much a comparatively unknown English drummer, to replace Rudd.
Simon Wright was, younger, a lot younger than the rest of them, and he'd been in various kind of fair to middling heavy metal bands, groups like Titan and A to Z, who were bands that never did anything. They supported Black Sabbath and bands of that nature, but never really gone anywhere in their own right. So he was, it was a dream, must have been a dream gig for him to have ended up in AC/DC.
But as soon as you replace Phil Rudd, however good Simon Wright was and is as a drummer, he's not AC/DC's drummer.
Well, it depends how honest you want to be about it, but I thought it was bloody awful. It just didn't sound right, to excuse the pun. It just sounded wrong.
Nobody does AC/DC's drumming better than Phil Rudd. So immediately they lost a little bit of what they had before, the greatest rhythm section around. Rudd, Cliff Williams on bass and Malcolm Young on rhythm guitar was scuppered.
The trick about AC/DC is, although the music sounds simple, it's incredibly difficult to play. And this is where a lot of people don't get this. And this is why, I've got such admiration for them as musicians. It's not easy to play at all.
Flick of the Switch was a change of direction for AC/DC. They went back and decided to produce themselves, got rid of Mutt Lange, who'd obviously done Highway to Hell, Back in Black, for those about to rock.
Good album, but by that time they ditched Mutt Lange, or Mutt Lange wasn't available, depending on who you believe. There was a great rumour at the time they were doing Flick of the Switch, that every night they were sending tapes across to Mutt Lange from the studio so that he could actually give his opinion. That wasn't true, but I think it showed the impact Mutt Lange had. Those rumours were emanating.
I don't know whether he was doing other things or whether they wanted him to jump ship and get a new sound. I don't really know about that, but I think it probably wasn't their best move at that time, because actually they could have made another great album at that time. I think they still had a couple of great records in them at that point.
I think it was an attempt after For Those About to Rock, which was quite a big production type album, maybe an attempt to go back to a more stripped down sound like they'd had on the albums they'd made with Bon Scott. The trouble is the songs, again, just weren't there. I mean, everything's credited to the Young Brothers and to Brian Johnson, but you look back at the track listing now, and there's very little on there that makes it into the set these days.
The real acid test of Flick of the Switch, of course, is, do they still play any songs off it? And the answer is, as with many albums made in the 1980s by AC/DC, no.
Flick of the Switch is a much more down-to-earth, limiting album, if you want to put it that way. They went back to basics. The Young Brothers effectively produced it. The songs were quite decent, it had its standout moments, but for the most part, it was the start of a downturn. it was the start of an era when AC/DC were making unsatisfactory albums that really were no more than an excuse to go out and perform live.
They were making money on the road, and I think there was probably a lot less thought was going into their albums. It's all right. You know, if I never heard it again, I wouldn't be too worried. But I think the fact that they changed producers at that point probably wasn't a great idea.
Flick of the Switch is, I would argue that's an underrated album, but a lot of people would say that it's rated about right.
Flick of the Switch, hugely underrated record. It's raw, brutal. It's Brian Johnson's Power Age almost.
There's some fun to be had there. Guns for Hire, that's a killer track. If I remember well, they opened at Donington with that in 1984, and it was a moment of tremendous excitement for me and thousands of others.
I don't know why it didn't do so well. It really, I guess because it didn't have a big hit single on it. But I mean, you just listen to tracks like Bedlam in Belgium, which I think is absolutely awesome.
How can you go wrong with a song called that? And they almost went wrong, but I like that. It's somebody once described AC/DC as being moronic brilliance, and I think Bedlam in Belgium is a very good example of that.
Maybe it's a little too raw for mainstream ears. I don't know. But for me, it's an absolute corker of a record. But everything was stripped down. Even, I mean, the album, it's just a line illustration of Angus hanging off a big power switch. Maybe it was just a little too simple for people's tastes. But for me, Flick of the Switch is a real gem of an album.
Malcolm Young will argue till he's blue in the face that Fly on the Wall is a credible album. That is a dog of an album. I mean, I got it when they were reissued recently, and I got it for free, and I still feel ripped off. I mean, I feel bad that it's taking up. Do you know, the worst thing is I've got to keep it because it's AC/DC. So it's possibly the worst album in my collection.
Fly on the Wall, like Flick of the Switch, these are the sort of the lost AC/DC albums. I mean, someone somewhere will turn around and tell you they're great records. I just don't think they were. And I mean, at the time, you know, the feeling was that the songs weren't there. They didn't have the hits. They just felt like they were going through the motions.
Personally, I don't rate Fly on the Wall, but I don't know many AC/DC fans that do. I know one who does, but he's a pervert.
I don't actually know why I like it particularly. I think I like it because it's so ham-fisted. And I have an affection for it because there's almost a naivety about songs like Sink the Pink and Shake Your Foundations and Playing with Girls and even Fly on the Wall itself. And even the cover, which had a big sort of cartoon fly on a wall, looking through a hole in the wall, had a certain sense of On the Buses. It was so dumb and stupid that somehow I became rather attached to it. I don't pretend it's a great album. I fully appreciate and understand why so many AC/DC fans would regard this as the worst album the band have ever done.
Fly on the Wall is the worst album AC/DC have ever made by some distance.
By this time, the success, they were huge. And I think they kind of lost track of where they were and what they were doing and what they were about.
They wrote some really hackneyed riffs, didn't bother trying to sort of weld that to any decent tunes. They knocked it out in what sounds like they knocked it out in 5 minutes. I mean, what a shocking sounding record. It's awful. What's the point in having that album? Because if you're going to play AC/DC, my God, you're not going to play that, are you? You're going to put a good album on.
Why do you throw it in the bin then?
Because I can't bear to leave it. I can't bear to throw it away because it says AC/DC on it, and that's how pathetic we AC/DC fans are.